She was mocked for being 40 and unmarried. Then the young cowboy said, "I've been waiting." They didn't whisper when she passed anymore. They laughed. Not behind hands, not discreetly, but openly, like the air itself had decided she was the punchline. Marianne Holt had lived in West Lorne for all of her 40 years, teaching arithmetic to the daughters of ranchers who now giggled when she walked by with her hair pinned too tightly and her dress just a little too well kept. She wasn't poor. She wasn't plain. But she was unmarried. And in a town where women married by 20 and became grandmothers by 35, that made her strange. She stood that morning in front of the little wooden church with her back straight, hands folded in front of her, eyes fixed on the preacher's closed door. It was Founders' Sunday, and the town gathered early, the benches filled with married couples and babies squirming in bonnets, all pressed and powdered. Marianne had chosen to sit alone, as she always did, but a group of young wives had beat her to her usual seat and left only the front row, where everyone could see her, empty. She stood instead, still, watching, unmoved. "If I reach 40 and I'm still single," one of the girls behind her said, loud enough, "just shoot me." Laughter rippled like it had been waiting to explode. Marianne didn't flinch, not even when the pastor's wife, sweet, cloying Abigail Stokes, walked past and offered a pitying smile like a veil of honey overwrought. The air smelled of rain and lavender oil and the faint smoke of sausage rolls being warmed nearby. But it was the horses that saved her. A slow clip of hooves on dry dirt silenced the crowd just long enough for everyone to turn. And that's when he rode in, young, clean-shaven, brown-eyed, dust on his boots, collar undone, reins loose like he wasn't used to being formal. He looked straight at her, didn't glance at the pretty girls in ribbons, didn't nod to the preacher, just kept his eyes on Marianne as he dismounted in a single, unhurried motion. The silence stretched. Someone coughed. A baby cried. Marianne's heart did nothing, not even a flutter, until he tipped his hat, looked her dead in the eye, and said, "I've been waiting to meet you, ma'am." No one had offered him a place to sit, but the cowboy didn't seem to mind. He tied his horse by the watering trough like he'd done it 100 times in this town, though no one recognized him. Marianne didn't move as he approached, her spine stiff but her fingers tightening ever so slightly around the small cloth bag she carried. "Marianne Holt," he said, not asking. "I'm Elias Brandt." The name stirred nothing in her, but his voice did. It was deep, calm, without the performative drawl most young men used to charm. "You're sitting with me?" she asked, not bothering to lower her voice. Heads turned. Old men shifted in their seats. Abigail Stokes whispered behind her fan. Elias nodded once. "I am, if you don't mind." Marianne said nothing, but she turned and walked into the chapel, her boots echoing against the wooden floor. She sat in the empty front row pew and let her bag rest beside her, not inviting, not refusing. Elias followed and sat without hesitation, leaving the space of a single hymn book between them. The preacher began to speak, but no one was listening. Not really. Marianne felt it in the way the air held its breath, the way glances bounced off her like stones skipping water. At her age, she had grown used to being the room's silence. Now she was its flame. During the third hymn, Elias didn't sing. He didn't bow his head or read the scripture. He just sat still, boots planted wide, hat in his lap, watching the stained glass like it meant something. When the offering plate came down the aisle, he placed a folded note inside instead of coins. Marianne noticed the pastor pause as he read it later, but said nothing. After the service, the crowd spilled into the yard again, louder than before, more urgent in its curiosity. Abigail swept toward her with false cheer. Marianne, dear, I wasn't aware you had a friend joining us today. Marianne didn't answer. Elias stepped forward instead. I'm here because I heard about a woman who taught half this town how to add, subtract, and stand taller than shame. He didn't say it loudly, but he said it clearly, and no one interrupted. Marianne felt her cheeks warm, not with embarrassment, but with the strange, slow bloom of something close to being seen. Abigail's smile cracked just slightly, and for once, she had no words. Marianne always walked home alone. It was a rule unspoken, kept more by others than by herself. The townsfolk knew her rhythm: post-sermon solitude, heels clicking against cobbled dust, shoulders square against the wind of whispers. But that afternoon, the young cowboy walked beside her, saying nothing, just matching her pace like he had every right. She didn't glance at him. Not once. But she didn't tell him to leave either. The path to her home passed through the edge of town, past the blacksmith's shop, the faded mercantile, the one oak that still bloomed in spring despite the soil's bitterness. Children stared. Grown men paused their hammering. Even Pastor Trumbull, sweeping his porch, stopped mid-stroke. Elias just walked. One hand held the small book she'd left on the pew by mistake. The other stayed at his side. You didn't have to follow, she said eventually, eyes still forward. Didn't, he agreed. Wanted to. I'm not a mystery to be solved. Didn't say you were. And I don't need anyone building stories about me. He paused, then offered, I'd rather build a porch. That made her stop. A real, unfiltered laugh slipped out, short, sharp, startled. She regretted it instantly but couldn't take it back. He smiled then, but only with his eyes. I saw the broken boards on your stoop, he explained. You've seen too much, she replied. That's how I was raised, to see what others skip. They kept walking. By the time they reached her fence, the world had shifted. The town was behind them. Only the wind moved now, brushing through dead grass and fence posts like a song almost forgotten. She opened the gate. He didn't step through. I'll be back tomorrow, he said. That porch won't fix itself. You think I'm going to let a boy fix my steps? I don't think anything, he said. I just show up when I say I will. She studied him then, really studied him. Not the tan of his skin or the worn cuffs of his shirt, but the steadiness in his eyes. She nodded once. You bring your own hammer? Yes, ma'am. And I'll be watching. Wouldn't expect less. With that, she turned and walked inside, the door shutting with the same softness her heart was trying to deny. By sunrise the next morning, the hammering had already begun. Marianne stood just inside the curtain, arms folded tight, watching the way Elias measured each board like he was building something sacred. He hadn't knocked, hadn't called out, just showed up, just like he said, with a hammer tucked in his belt and a bundle of fresh cedar slats under one arm. No one ever came early for her. No one waited on her porch who wasn't selling something or trying to save her. She made her tea slow, giving herself time to doubt him. Maybe he'd ask for breakfast. Maybe he'd want to talk. Maybe he was just another young fool with a mother-shaped hole in his chest, looking for kindness in all the wrong places. But none of those maybes came true. He worked without a word, sleeves rolled high, sweat already darkening his collar. She opened the door only when the second plank was down. You mismeasured, she said. That corner won't square. He didn't look up. Already fixed it. Wasn't the board, it was the beam beneath. She leaned on the frame. You're not as green as you look. No, ma'am, he said, still nailing. But I take correction easy. Her lips twitched. You're strange. I've been told. They stayed like that for a while. Him building, her pretending not to watch. A bird landed on the fence post nearby, chirping at the intrusion. Somewhere down the hill, church bells rang the hour, and with them came the inevitable. Neighbors passing by, slowing just enough to stare. One old woman across the road shielded her eyes like Marianne's home had become some sort of sideshow. She didn't flinch. Let them look. Let them wonder what a woman nearing 40 and a boy not yet 30 were doing exchanging silence and lumber. She stepped onto the half-done porch and picked up the second hammer he'd laid out. "I used to fix things myself," she said, kneeling, "before people started deciding what I should and shouldn't do." Elias didn't grin. He didn't make a comment. He just shifted left to give her room. They worked like that, the two of them, hammering side by side, the sound of wood splitting and nails catching filling the air. By mid-morning, the stoop was no longer broken. It wasn't elegant or smooth, but it was solid. And for the first time in years, Marianne stepped onto her own porch without feeling like it might give way. She looked down at the fresh grain, then sideways at the man beside her. "Next time," she said, "you fix the fence." Elias tipped his hat. "Yes, ma'am." She turned to go in, but this time left the door open behind her. By mid-week, the chickens had gotten into the garden again, and Marianne had lost patience with the lopsided gate she'd meant to fix last spring. She walked the field perimeter in the heat, checked the posts, cursed at the loosened wires, and somewhere near the far oak, twisted her ankle hard enough to drop the basket of tools and bite down on a scream. The sky spun, her knee hit the dirt, and the whole wide world felt too far away from her porch. She sat there in the brittle grass, stubborn tears prickling but not falling, muttering curses that didn't match her apron. When she heard boots pounding the path, she didn't call out, just looked up to see Elias coming fast, his eyes wide like he already knew. "Don't," she warned, but he was already kneeling, already pulling her boot off like it was a sacred task. "It's not broken," he murmured, examining the swelling, "but you're not walking on it." "I've handled worse," she said. "I know," he replied. And that was the worst part. He meant it. He didn't offer to carry her. He didn't talk about how hard it must be. He just looped one arm under hers and let her lean against his shoulder as they walked, one careful step at a time, back toward the house. The silence between them wasn't tense. It was focused, respectful, balanced like a scale. Inside, he guided her to the chair and disappeared. She thought he'd leave. Men didn't stay when a woman needed something real. But he returned with cold water, a cloth, and the small tin of balm she kept for winter cracks. "This'll sting," he warned, then gently wrapped her ankle. His hands were rough, but his movements weren't. "Why are you doing this?" she asked finally. Looking down at her red skin, her twisted limb, the folds of her skirt heavy over her knee. "Because you're the kind of woman who thinks she has to do it alone," he said. "And I don't think that's fair." She didn't answer. Couldn't, not with her throat tight the way it was. He didn't ask for thanks, didn't linger. Just tidied the rag, set the pitcher aside, and swept the porch like that's what men were supposed to do when women couldn't. When the wind rose that evening, rattling the shutters, she watched him pull them shut. Not because he was trying to impress her, not because he needed something, but because it was her house, and he was making sure it held. She slept lighter that night, not because she feared judgment or injury, but because for once she didn't have to be strong in every room. She could hurt and still be seen. The rooster hadn't even crowed when Marianne woke to the smell of burnt coffee, and something worse. Eggs, maybe, or sorrow dressed as breakfast. She limped toward the kitchen, ankle still tender but wrapped neat the way he'd left it, and found Elias standing over the stove like a man staring down a wild animal. The pan sizzled with confusion. "You don't have to," she started. "I do," he said, fumbling with the spatula like it had wronged him. "You're not on your feet today, and I can read directions, mostly." She raised an eyebrow. "You read directions?" He smirked, holding up her old, oil-smudged recipe paper with a single thumbprint covering the measurements. "Sort of." The biscuits were more hockey puck than hearth, the eggs too hard, and the coffee had clearly boiled twice. But when he poured her a mug and slid the plate toward her, Marianne laughed for the first time in weeks, real, low, belly-deep laughter that startled even her. Elias looked up sharply. "That bad?" "No," she said between breaths. "It's perfect. You didn't salt the eggs." "I was gonna, but the tin looked like sugar." "It is sugar." They both laughed then, quietly, and something inside the walls softened. He didn't offer excuses. He just sat, drank his own burned coffee, and listened as she corrected him on which shelf the flour actually belonged on. When the fire dimmed, he refilled it. When her chair creaked under shifting weight, he steadied it with one hand. The way he moved around the room wasn't graceful, but it was aware, intentional, the way someone behaves when they know they don't own the space and don't want to trespass. When she rose to rinse her cup, he stood too fast, bumping into her, his calloused hand brushing her wrist. "Sorry," he said, stepping back. She didn't. Not right away. "I'm not." He looked at her, really looked this time. Not past her or through her, not at her weight or her age or the shame townsfolk had glued to her back like a name tag. Just her. Woman. Whole. Unclaimed. Then he turned toward the door like he'd said something with his eyes, and didn't want to wait for the reply. Outside, the day was still half asleep, fog rising off the field. She stood there in the kitchen, ankle throbbing, heart steady, and let the silence hold her. Because it wasn't the burned breakfast that had moved her. It was the fact that someone tried. Someone failed, stayed, and tried again. It was just past noon when a wagon she hadn't seen in years creaked into the yard, and Marianne knew without looking that it was her father. No other man rode that stiff-backed. No other man wore a coat 2 decades out of season like pride kept it mended. Elias was splitting fence posts at the edge of the field, and he straightened only when he saw the man dismount without invitation. "Where is she?" her father called, voice still sharp like it had always cut before it asked. Marianne stepped out onto the porch, not out of courage, but because hiding had never worked anyway. "I'm not yours to collect," she said. The old man looked her up and down with the same disgust he used when she was 12 and dared eat 2 biscuits. "You'll come," he said. "That boy you embarrassed's got a proper wife now. But there's a widow preacher up in Laramie." "She's not going anywhere," Elias said, quiet, stepping between them without touching her. Her father's eyes narrowed. "You think she belongs to you?" "No," Elias replied. "That's why I'm here." The silence that followed could have broken glass. "You got no claim? No paper? She ain't even worth your name?" Marianne didn't flinch this time. She stepped forward herself. "Then good thing he's never once asked me to take it." Her voice didn't tremble. Her legs did, but not her voice. Her father turned, red blooming at his throat. "You'll rot out here, you know that?" "Better than starving where I'm not welcome," she said. The man looked past her once, at the cabin, the chicken coop, the clothesline. Then he spat in the dirt and climbed back onto his wagon. "You'll cry for mercy yet, girl," he muttered. "Not yours," she answered. The wagon rolled out slower than it came in. Elias didn't say anything, didn't reach for her, didn't pretend it hadn't happened. He just stood there, jaw locked, eyes following the road long after the dust settled. Marianne leaned on the porch rail, hands tight. "You don't have to fix what he broke," she said. Elias didn't move. "I know," he said, "but I can build something that doesn't break you more." She didn't cry. Not then. She just nodded once and went back inside, because some words weren't meant to be answered out loud. The next Sunday, Marianne stepped into town for the first time since that birthday 8 years ago, when 37 had meant failure and silence. Now 40 didn't feel like a verdict. It felt like something earned. Elias walked beside her, not holding her, not leading, but walking like a man who had always meant to arrive here beside her. The townspeople noticed. That part was impossible not to feel. Whispers curled like smoke, glances flinched away, then returned twice as bold. The butcher's wife elbowed her friend. The schoolmaster looked down at Marianne's unpainted hands and then up at her eyes. But no one spoke, because Elias was beside her, and because the mayor's wife, once the loudest tongue in town, stepped aside at the bakery door to let Marianne pass first. "Morning," the woman mumbled. Marianne nodded. It wasn't triumph. It was something better. Stillness, not acceptance, not applause, but no more mockery. That was worth more than she thought it would be. Inside the church, she sat where she used to sit. Third pew, aisle seat, alone. But this time Elias didn't take the row behind. He sat next to her, palms flat on his knees, jaw still tight. She whispered, "You okay?" He nodded, then leaned closer and said just loud enough, "I want them to see me where I want to be." That's when the preacher looked up from his Bible, paused, and offered the barest nod before starting the hymn. And that's when a small voice behind them whispered, "Mama, she looks like a queen." Marianne turned slightly, saw a little girl in ribbons nudging her mother and smiling. The woman didn't shush her. She smiled too. Elias never looked away from the front. But his pinky found hers on the wooden bench. Not a hold, not a grip, just a touch. After the service, when the crowd spilled outside, an old man she didn't know tipped his hat to her. The baker nodded and handed her a warm roll without charge. Someone behind her muttered, "40 don't look so bad on her." Marianne didn't answer. She didn't need to. Her shoulders stood straighter than they ever had, and her dress, though plain, didn't try to make her smaller. On the walk home, Elias finally spoke. "Was that too much?" he asked. "The church, all of it?" She shook her head. "It wasn't enough," she said. "But it was the first time I didn't feel erased just by standing still." He smiled then, softly. "Good, because I wasn't going to sit anywhere else." And Marianne laughed, not the careful kind, not the polite kind, but a full, rich, too loud laugh that made a dog bark and a child peek from a window. Elias didn't tell her to hush. He just looked at her like maybe everything he'd ever waited for was standing there in dusty boots, laughing in front of him, finally unafraid of being heard. That evening, after supper, the cabin was quiet in the way homes are only when something is about to change. Marianne had dried the dishes slowly, not because there were many, but because her hands were trembling in a way they hadn't since her first kiss at 19. Elias had gone outside to chop wood, but she knew the pile was already full. He needed motion more than fuel. Through the window she watched him swing, pause, swing again, not rushing, not performing, just breathing through whatever it was he hadn't said yet. When he finally came in, he didn't speak right away. He took off his boots at the door, wiped his hands, and stood by the small fire she'd kept burning for no reason other than comfort. Marianne sat at the table, waiting. "I almost left," he said quietly, eyes on the flames. "Back in summer." Before I ever knocked on your door." Her breath caught, but she didn't move. "Why didn't you?" she asked. He turned, finally, and looked at her. Not the way men glance, but the way they remember something before they say it. "Because I saw you through the window, bent over that garden, laughing at a chicken that wouldn't move." She stared at him. "That was a terrible day. I lost 3 eggs." "I know," he said, smiling just slightly. "But you didn't yell. You just kept going. I hadn't seen that kind of quiet in years." He stepped closer, slowly. "And I knew then that if I left without trying, I'd always wonder what kind of peace lived in a woman like that." Marianne didn't smile, not yet. "Elias," he knelt. Not dramatic, just slow and sure, like his legs already knew the weight of this moment. He didn't pull out a ring. Didn't offer flowers. He took her hand and placed it gently against his chest. "I don't need an answer tonight," he said. "But I've waited a long time to ask the question right. So here it is. Will you let me build a life beside you, not around you?" Her throat burned. Her whole life, people had asked her to wait, to settle, to hush, to disappear. This man, this younger man with arms like earth and eyes like storms long past, had just asked her to be seen. Fully. Equal. "I'm 40, she whispered. "Good," he said. "Then you'll know not to say yes just to be kind." Her laugh shook. Then, finally, she nodded. Not fast, not teary, just sure. "Then you better get off your knees," she said, pulling him up by the hand he hadn't let go of. "This house isn't going to build itself." He kissed her hand. Not the back, not the palm, but the wrist. Right where her pulse kicked loud. It was the first time in years she hadn't felt older than her heart. The wind carried the faint scent of soil and early rain, stirring the prairie grass in soft waves that bent toward the old fence line. Marianne stood by the front porch, her apron still dusted with flour from the morning's biscuits, watching Elias dig the last post into place. There were already beams laid, squared corners marked, and a half-framed barn taking shape behind them. But it wasn't just the building that made her heart full. It was the fact that someone was doing it with her. For years, people had assumed she was too old to start something, too odd to partner with, too stubborn to follow. And she had been stubborn, but not about control, only about dignity. Elias straightened his back, wiped sweat from his brow, and caught her watching. "It's crooked," he said, nodding toward the post. "But so am I. And you didn't toss me out." She smiled. "I'm not fixing either." He chuckled, walked up to the porch, and didn't hesitate before taking her face in his hands. "You were never waiting for permission, were you?" She shook her head. "Just for someone who'd start building instead of asking if I should have." He kissed her forehead, not like a lover claiming something, but like a man thanking a truth he'd been lucky enough to meet. The town hadn't said much, but they didn't mock her anymore. And that silence was its own kind of respect. Even the woman who once whispered behind her back had brought over sourdough starter and borrowed seeds, pretending nothing had ever passed between them. Elias unpacked 2 stools and set them under the awning. They sat together, knees almost touching. "When winter comes," he said, "we'll close this side off with shutters. Maybe a stove here, if we can trade for iron." Marianne nodded slowly. "And when spring comes again," she said, "we'll plant honeysuckle along the fence. I want something that grows fast but doesn't demand much." "Like you?" he asked softly. She laughed, a sound that had once come brittle but now fell loose and warm. "No, Elias. Like us." For a moment, nothing moved but the clouds. Then Elias leaned back, boots tapping lightly against the porch wood. You think people will say anything about us?" She turned toward him, sharp but soft. "If they do, they'll be too late, because we already are." His breath caught. And then, without needing to ask or wait, he reached out and took her hand. No ring, no preacher, just calloused fingers across hers and the quiet knowledge that, at last, neither of them was waiting for anything. Behind them, the sun dipped low, casting long shadows that made the half-built barn look like a cathedral. And for the first time in her 40 years, Marianne did not feel behind. She felt exactly right on time. Please like, share, and subscribe to support more true-hearted stories on Stories Left Behind. If someone told you that 40 was too late for love, would you still wait for the right person? Tell us in the comments.